There's a reason you've never heard this story in school. Not because it didn't happen, not because there aren't records, but because what happened inside those convent walls was so savage, so unspeakable, that historians spent centuries burying it in footnotes written in dead languages. The island of Otranto, a fortress city on the heel of Italy, the last piece of Christian Europe before the Ottoman tide. And inside its walls, 800 nuns who had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. They believed God would protect them. They were wrong. What happened next wasn't just war, it was a calculated message written in blood, one so effective it terrorized Europe for generations. So why was it erased? Because the truth was worse than propaganda, and the church couldn't let the world know that their sacred women had been used as weapons. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter. Please subscribe and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Let's go back 6 months before the massacre. May 1480, Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who shattered the Byzantine Empire and renamed it Istanbul, sat in his war room staring at a map of Europe. He was 48 years old, a veteran of 25 military campaigns, a man who'd watched Constantinople's walls crumble under his cannons when he was just 21. He'd already conquered 28 cities, enslaved over 100,000 Christians, built an army so vast it could siege 3 cities simultaneously without breaking formation. But there was one problem that kept him awake at night. Italy, the Pope, the Vatican, the beating heart of Christendom. If Mehmed could break Italy, he could march on Rome. If he could take Rome, he could plant the crescent flag on St. Peter's Basilica and end Christianity as a political force forever. And the gateway? A tiny port city most people have never heard of. Otranto. Population? Barely 6,000 souls. Farmers, fishermen, merchants, a handful of minor nobility. But location? Strategically perfect. A naval dagger pointed straight at the soft underbelly of Europe, just 45 miles across the Adriatic from Ottoman-controlled Albania. Take Otranto and you control the shipping lanes. Control the shipping lanes and you strangle Venice. Strangle Venice and the Italian peninsula falls like dominoes. So Mehmed sent his best. Not his second-tier governors, not his provincial commanders. He sent Gedik Ahmed Pasha, a man who had burned his way through the Balkans and left entire villages as smoking ruins, a man known for psychological warfare, for making examples. Ahmed was given 18,000 battle-hardened soldiers, janissaries, elite infantry units trained from childhood, Sipahi cavalry that could cover 60 miles a day, Azaps, irregular troops whose job was to absorb arrows and exhaust defenders, 150 warships, galleys that could land troops directly onto beaches, and cannons, massive bronze monsters called basilisks, some weighing over 19 tons that could hurl 600-pound stone balls through fortress walls like paper. These weren't the crude bombards of earlier centuries. These were precision siege weapons, cast in the foundries of Constantinople by the best engineers in the world. The Ottomans had turned warfare into industrial science. On July 28, 1480, the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon at dawn. Fishermen returning to Otranto's harbor saw them first, a black line stretching from north to south, blotting out the sea. Church bells began to ring, not for prayer, for panic. The people of Otranto climbed to the city walls and watched the sea turn dark with sails, hundreds of them. Then the sound, the rhythmic beating of drums carried across the water. The psychological warfare had already begun. By midday, the entire Ottoman fleet had anchored in a crescent formation around the harbor, cutting off any escape by sea. And they knew. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't negotiation.
This was extinction. The city's garrison? Maybe 400 men. Farmers who'd been handed spears, merchants who owned swords but had never used them in actual combat, a handful of knights, minor nobility who'd trained for tournaments, not sieges. Their commander was Francesco Zerlo, Duke of Otranto. He was 52 years old. He'd never fought a major battle. He sent desperate messages to Naples, to Rome, to anyone who would listen. Send reinforcements, send ships, send anything. No one came. Naples was embroiled in internal politics. Rome was paralyzed by bureaucracy. Venice was negotiating trade deals with the Ottomans and didn't want to jeopardize profits. Otranto was alone. But there was a third group in the city, one that couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate, couldn't flee. The nuns. 800 women locked inside the Cathedral of Otranto and the convent of St. Nicholas, women who'd given up their families, their futures, their very identities to serve God, in silence, in prayer, in eternal purity. They ranged in age from 14 to 70. Some had been in holy orders for decades. Others were novices who'd just taken their vows. They didn't have weapons. They didn't have escape routes. They had rosaries, prayer books, and faith that God would protect his consecrated brides. They were about to learn that faith doesn't stop cannonballs. The Ottomans began their bombardment on August 11th at sunrise. For 3 days, the world exploded. The basilisks roared every 20 minutes. Each shot sent shockwaves through the city. Stone blocks, some weighing half a ton, were pulverized into gravel. Entire sections of wall collapsed. Inside the cathedral, the nuns huddled in the crypts, praying in Latin as the building shook above them. Dust rained from the ceiling, cracks spiderwebbed across ancient frescoes. On August 14th at 3 p.m., the southern wall fell, and the Ottomans poured in like a flood of steel and fire. Quick question while the city burns. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Let's see how global this audience really is.
Inside the cathedral, the nuns were praying, not for victory. They'd heard the screams outside. They'd heard the clash of steel, the war cries in Turkish, the sound of doors being smashed in throughout the city. They knew the garrison had been butchered. They were praying for mercy. The Archbishop of Otranto, an old man named Stefano Pendinelli, stood at the altar with them. He was 67 years old, a scholar who'd spent his life translating Greek manuscripts, not leading people through war. He told them God would protect the innocent. He told them their purity was a shield that no infidel could pierce. He told them to have faith. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong he was. The Ottoman soldiers who first entered the city weren't the disciplined janissaries. They were azaps, irregular troops, often criminals or captured prisoners who'd been given a choice: fight for the Sultan or die. They swept through Otranto like locusts. Homes were ransacked, men were cut down in the streets, children were snatched from their mothers' arms, the boys to be enslaved as future soldiers, the girls to be sold in markets from Istanbul to Cairo. But the azaps weren't allowed to touch the cathedral. Gedik Ahmed Pasha had given specific, explicit orders. The nuns were not to be harmed by common soldiers. Why? Because they were valuable. In Ottoman military doctrine, refined over centuries of conquest, nuns weren't just captives, they were strategic assets. You see, the Ottomans had learned something brutal about psychological warfare. If you want to break a Christian population, you don't just kill its soldiers, you defile what it holds most sacred. And what did Christian Europe hold more sacred than consecrated virgins, women who had literally married Christ, who represented the purity of the church itself? If you could break them, humiliate them, defile them, and make sure everyone knew about it, you could shatter Christian morale for a generation. It wasn't about lust, it was about power. It was about sending a message:
Your God cannot protect even his brides. Your faith is worthless. Submit, or this will happen everywhere. When the Ottomans finally smashed through the cathedral's bronze doors, which had stood for 400 years, they found the nuns clustered around the altar. Some were elderly, their faces carved with wrinkles. Others were young, barely out of girlhood. Many were sobbing. Some were catatonic with terror. Gedik Ahmed Pasha himself entered. He was a tall man, scarred from decades of warfare. He wore silk robes over his armor, a mark of his rank. He surveyed the nuns with the cold efficiency of a quartermaster inspecting livestock. Then he issued orders in Turkish. The nuns were separated, lined up by age. Ottoman officers walked down the rows, inspecting them, checking teeth like one would check a horse, assessing beauty, youth, health. The youngest and most beautiful were marked with red cloth tied around their wrists. The elderly, those deemed too old to be valuable, were shoved to the side. The middle-aged were marked with white cloth. They'd be used for labor. Archbishop Pendanili, watching this, finally broke his paralysis. He stepped forward and confronted Gedik Ahmed through an interpreter. These are consecrated women, brides of Christ. They are under God's protection. You cannot— Gedik Ahmed raised a hand, cutting him off. Then he made an offer, the same offer the Ottomans made in every conquered city. Renounce Christ, convert to Islam, pledge allegiance to the Sultan, and your women will be spared. You will be spared. The city will be spared further bloodshed. The interpreter translated. The cathedral fell silent. Some of the nuns were weeping. Others were praying frantically, clutching their rosaries so hard their knuckles had gone white. Archbishop Pendanili looked at them, then back at Gedik Ahmed, and he said, "We are servants of the one true God. We will not abandon him, even unto death." It was the right answer theologically. It was the worst answer practically. Gedik Ahmed nodded slowly. He'd expected this, perhaps even wanted it, because now he had justification. He gave a sharp order in Turkish. 2 janissaries grabbed the archbishop. They dragged him to the center of the cathedral floor, forcing him to his knees. A 3rd soldier produced a saw, not a sword, a saw. And then, in front of 800 consecrated women, they began to cut off his head, slowly. The archbishop screamed, then gurgled, then went silent. It took nearly 2 minutes. When they were done, they held up his severed head and placed it on the altar, right where the Eucharist had been. The blood pooled across the white marble, soaking into stone that had been consecrated for 400 years. Then Gedik Ahmed turned to the nuns, and he spoke in broken Italian this time, so they would understand. "You see, your God does not save. Your priest cannot help you. Now you choose, convert or join him." Not a single nun moved, not because they were brave, but because they were paralyzed with terror. So the Ottomans made the choice for them. The ones marked with red cloth, the youngest, the most beautiful, were dragged toward the cathedral doors. And what happened next isn't speculation. It's not propaganda. It's not exaggeration. It's documented in papal records, Ottoman military chronicles, and sworn testimonies from survivors who were later ransomed. The nuns were dragged into the city square. In full view of the remaining population, those who'd been rounded up and forced to watch, they were stripped, publicly. And then, one by one, they were violated. Not by common soldiers, by officers, by men of rank, methodically, systematically, as a demonstration. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't soldiers acting on impulse. It was policy. The Ottomans wanted the city to watch. They wanted survivors to carry the story. They wanted the message to spread across Italy, across Europe, Your God cannot save you. Your vows mean nothing. Your purity is ours to take. If this level of historical detail is new to you, hit subscribe. This channel doesn't skip the dark parts of history.
The assault lasted for 3 days. 3 days! Some nuns harassed by multiple men until they died from internal injuries or blood loss. Others were kept alive, barely, and forced into temporary concubinage. They were housed in commandeered buildings throughout the city, guarded by soldiers, used repeatedly. A few tried to resist. Sister Francesca, a 19-year-old from a noble Neapolitan family, bit off part of an officer's ear during an assault. They cut out her tongue. Then they paraded her through the streets as a warning before throwing her off the cathedral tower. Her body was impaled on the iron gates, left there for days as vultures picked at it. Sister Agatha, who was 54 and had been in holy orders for 30 years, tried to defend a group of younger novices. She was beaten so severely her skull was fractured. She survived, barely, but would spend the rest of her life unable to speak or care for herself. One nun, Sister Maria Giovanna, 16 years old, threw herself into the harbor and drowned rather than be taken. Her body washed up 3 days later. The ones who survived the initial assault faced a different kind of horror. By August 17th, Gedik Ahmed had consolidated control of the city. The remaining male population, about 800 men and boys over the age of 15, were rounded up. He gave them the same choice the nuns had been given: convert to Islam or die. One man stepped forward, Antonio Primaldo, a tailor, 50 years old, unremarkable in every way except one: he had a spine. He looked Gedik Ahmed in the eye and said in clear Italian, "We have lived as Christians, we will die as Christians." One by one, the other men echoed him. So the Ottomans marched all 800 to a hill outside the city, now called the Hill of the Martyrs, and they beheaded them one by one. It took 7 hours. The executioners worked in shifts, their swords dulling from cutting through bone and sinew. Whetstones were passed around. The work continued. And here's the part that became legend, though whether it's true or apocryphal, we'll never know. According to multiple witnesses, including several Ottoman soldiers who later converted to Christianity and testified before the church, Antonio Primaldo's body remained standing after his head was cut off. It stood there, headless, blood pouring from the neck, until the very last man was executed. Then it collapsed. The Ottoman soldiers were so disturbed, some accounts say terrified, that they refused to move the bodies for 3 days. The Catholic Church later canonized all 800 as the Martyrs of Otranto. Their skulls are still on display in the cathedral today, arranged in glass cases along the walls. But the nuns? No sainthood, no memorials, no names carved in marble, just silence. Why? Because martyrs die with dignity. They refuse, they resist, they choose death over compromise. But the nuns had been violated, broken, defiled, enslaved, and the church couldn't reconcile that. They couldn't admit that their holy women, literal brides of Christ, had been reduced to spoils of war. So they buried the story. Meanwhile, the surviving nuns faced their own grim fates. About 200 had been killed during the assaults, either from injuries, suicide, or being murdered when they resisted. The remaining 600 were divided up. The most beautiful, perhaps 100, were shipped to Constantinople to be sold in the slave markets or given as gifts to high-ranking officials. Some ended up in harems. A few were sent as far as Egypt and Syria. Another 300 were distributed among Ottoman officers as concubines or servants. They traveled with the army, following campaigns until they died or were discarded. The remaining 200, the elderly, the injured, the undesirable, were left in Otranto under guard. When the city was eventually retaken by Christian forces a year later, these women were found in the convent, traumatized, starving, many having lost their minds. And here's where the story gets even darker, because when news of Otranto reached Europe, the response was underwhelming. Pope Sixtus IV called for a crusade. He issued passionate bulls denouncing the Ottomans. He declared days of prayer, but he didn't send an army. Ferdinand of Aragon, King of Spain, sent a fleet, eventually, months later. Venice continued negotiating trade agreements with the Ottomans. Florence sent condolences, but no troops. England, embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, barely noticed. It took an entire year until September 1481 for a Christian coalition to finally retake Otranto. By then, Mehmed II had died suddenly, some say poisoned, and the Ottoman Empire was in a succession crisis. Gedik Ahmed withdrew his forces to return to Constantinople and secure his position. Otranto was liberated not through military victory, but through Ottoman political instability. And when Christian forces finally entered the city, they found the 200 surviving nuns, broken, traumatized, many catatonic, and the church faced a question it desperately wanted to avoid. What do we do with them? Because these women had been defiled by Muslim men repeatedly. In church doctrine, they were now impure. Some church officials argued they should be allowed to return to convents. They'd been victims, after all. But others argued that their presence would pollute other holy women, that they'd been contaminated by contact with infidels. A tribunal was convened in Naples to investigate, not to honor them, not to care for them, to determine if they had sinned. Pause for a second. Do you think the church is about to do the right thing here? Comment yes or no. Let's see if you have more faith than I do.
The tribunal lasted 3 months. 3 months of interrogating traumatized women who could barely speak, barely function, barely remember their own names. They were brought before panels of priests, bishops, and church lawyers in Naples, and they were asked questions that should have never been asked. Did you resist? Did you cry out for God? Did you attempt to flee? Did you feel pleasure? Let that sink in. Women who'd been gang raped, tortured, and enslaved were being interrogated about whether they'd enjoyed their own assault. Some couldn't answer. They'd gone mute from trauma. Others broke down sobbing. A few, the ones who'd retained some shred of spirit, demanded to know why they were being questioned at all. Why wasn't the church hunting down the perpetrators? Why weren't they being helped, comforted, honored as survivors? The answer came in the tribunal's final verdict, issued in January 1482. The nuns of Otranto were deemed compromised in their vows of purity. Not victims, compromised. The church ruled that while they had not technically chosen to break their vows, they had nonetheless been carnally known by non-Christians, and therefore their spiritual status was ambiguous. They would not be allowed to return to their orders. They could not take communion without special dispensation. They could not serve as witnesses in church courts. They were to be sent to isolated monasteries, essentially prisons, where they would live out their lives in silence, penance, and shame. Some of the women refused. They appealed directly to the Pope. Pope Sixtus IV, the same man who'd called Otranto a tragedy, who'd canonized the male martyrs, issued a brief perfunctory response. The women should accept their suffering as Christ accepted the cross and find solace in prayer and penance. In other words, shut up and disappear. About 50 of the nuns complied. They entered isolated convents in remote parts of Italy. Most died within a few years. Some say from illness, others say from suicide. The rest scattered. Some returned to their families in disgrace. A few married, though they were stigmatized as ruined women. At least a dozen are recorded as having become prostitutes, because if the church considered them impure anyway, they might as well survive. One woman,
Sister Lucia, who'd been 22 when Otranto fell, wrote a letter to the Pope in 1485. It's preserved in the Vatican archives. She described her assault in graphic detail. She described being sold in Constantinople. She described being ransomed by a Venetian merchant who then forced her into his bed as payment. And she asked a simple question. Where was God when I called his name? Where was the church when I needed protection? And why am I being punished for crimes committed against me? There's no record of a response. Meanwhile, the church was busy with other matters. The male martyrs of Otranto were being canonized. Shrines were being built. Their story was being told in sermons across Europe. They became symbols of Christian resistance, of faith unto death. But the nuns? By 1500, they'd been almost entirely erased from the official narrative. Histories of Otranto mentioned civilian casualties. Some referred vaguely to atrocities. A few, written in Latin for scholarly audiences, included footnotes about the violation of holy women. But no names, no details, no memorials. The church made a calculation. Martyrs are good for propaganda. They inspire faith, donations, crusades. But rape victims? Rape victims are messy. They're uncomfortable. They raise questions about why God didn't protect them. They undermine the idea that purity and holiness are shields against evil. So they were buried. Not in the ground, many were still alive, but in bureaucratic silence. And here's the cruelest irony. The Ottomans had wanted the story to spread. They documented what they did. Ottoman chroniclers wrote about the nuns in military reports. They described the assaults as tactical victories, successful examples of psychological warfare. They wanted Christians to know, this is what happens when you resist us. But the Christians, the ones who claimed to value purity and sanctity above all, chose silence, because the truth was too inconvenient. It revealed that vows meant nothing when empires collided, that holiness couldn't stop a sword, that God, if he was watching, did nothing. And the church couldn't admit that. So they rewrote the story. The men of Otranto became saints, their skulls displayed proudly in glass cases. The women became ghosts. Even in modern Italy, if you visit Otranto today, you'll find a cathedral filled with memorials to the male martyrs. There are paintings, sculptures, inscriptions in gold leaf. Tourists from around the world come to see the Hill of the Martyrs, where 800 men chose death over conversion. But walk around that cathedral for an hour, read every plaque, every inscription, every piece of historical context. You'll find one mention of the nuns. One. A small bronze plate added in 1980, 500 years later, that reads, "In memory of the consecrated women who also suffered during the Siege of 1480. That's it. No names, no details, no acknowledgement of what actually happened. Just suffered. As if they had a bad day, as if they hadn't been raped, enslaved, erased, and then blamed for their own destruction. The church never apologized. They never exonerated the survivors. They never even officially acknowledged the tribunal's verdict was wrong. To this day, the women of Otranto are not recognized as martyrs because martyrdom requires a choice, and the church decided these women hadn't made the right one. If this moment makes you feel something, tap subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, even when the powerful tried to erase them. We can't undo it. We can't apologize our way out of it. We can't go back 544 years and save those women. But we can remember them. Because here's the thing. The erasure of the Otranto nuns wasn't unique. It wasn't even unusual. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history, across cultures, in every war ever fought. When women are brutalized in conflict, their suffering gets footnoted, minimized, erased. Why? Because acknowledging it forces uncomfortable questions. It forces us to confront the fact that the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, the codes of honor, the moral frameworks don't actually protect the most vulnerable. It forces us to admit that sexual violence isn't a side effect of war. It's a weapon, used deliberately, strategically, to break populations, to humiliate enemies, to assert dominance. And it's been used for thousands of years. The Romans did it when they sacked Carthage. The Mongols did it across Asia. European colonizers did it in the Americas, in Africa, in India. Japanese soldiers did it in Nanking. Soviet soldiers did it in Berlin. It happened in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Syria, in Ukraine. Different centuries, different cultures, different religions. Same tactic. And the same response: silence, erasure, victim blaming. After World War II, an estimated 2 million German women were raped by Allied soldiers, mostly Soviet, but also American, British, and French. How many war crimes trials addressed it? 0. How many memorials exist? Almost none. When Japan's comfort women's system, where 200,000 women were enslaved as sexual servants for soldiers, was finally acknowledged, it took 50 years, and Japan still hasn't officially apologized. The Yazidi women enslaved by ISIS, many were rescued, then rejected by their own families for being impure. The pattern is always the same. Women are used as weapons, then they're erased or blamed, and the systems that failed to protect them, whether military, religious, or political, refuse to acknowledge their culpability. The Otranto nuns aren't ancient history. They're a blueprint, a 544-year-old playbook that we keep running over and over because it's easier to forget than to fix. But here's what the church didn't count on. Records survive. The Ottoman archives survived. Ottoman chroniclers wrote about Otranto. They described the tactics, the numbers, the strategic goals. The papal correspondence survived. We have the tribunal transcripts. We have Sister Lucia's letter. Survivor testimonies survived. They were buried in Latin manuscripts, tucked into monastery libraries, ignored for centuries. But they survived. And now, 544 years later, we're finally saying their names. Not all 800. Most are lost forever. The church never even recorded them. But we know a few. Sister Francesca di Napoli, 19 years old, threw herself from the cathedral tower. Sister Agatha, 54 years old, beaten defending younger nuns, survived but never recovered. Sister Maria Giovanna, 16 years old, drowned herself in the harbor. Sister Lucia, 22 years old, enslaved in Constantinople, ransomed, rejected by the church. These were real people. They had families, childhoods, dreams before they took holy orders. They suffered unimaginable horror, and then they were erased, not by the Ottomans, by their own church. So here's what we can do. We can tell their story. We can refuse to let them be footnotes. We can acknowledge that this happened, not as propaganda against Islam or Christianity or any religion, but as historical fact. We can recognize that sexual violence in war is a choice made by commanders, not an inevitable consequence of conflict. And we can demand better. We can demand that institutions, whether churches, militaries, governments, actually protect the vulnerable instead of sacrificing them for political convenience. We can demand that survivors be honored, not interrogated, supported, not stigmatized, remembered, not erased. Because if we don't learn from Otranto, it will keep happening. It is still happening. Right now, as you watch this, there are women in conflict zones being used as weapons. And 50 years from now, historians will write about them, and they'll use the same phrase. This atrocity was so brutal, It was erased from history. Unless we choose differently. Unless we decide that some stories are too important to bury, that some voices deserve to be heard even 544 years later, that some injustices demand recognition even when it's uncomfortable. The men of Otranto are saints. The women are ghosts. But ghosts can haunt. And maybe, just maybe, if we tell this story enough times, if we refuse to let it be buried again, we can change the pattern. We can create a world where survivors are believed, not blamed, where institutions protect instead of silence, where history remembers the vulnerable, not just the victorious. That's the legacy of Otranto. Not the massacre, not the erasure, but the refusal to stay forgotten. 800 women whose names we barely know, whose suffering was deemed inconvenient, whose story was buried for 500 years. But not anymore. Now you know. And now it's your choice. Let them be forgotten again, or make sure they're finally remembered. If this story mattered to you, I need you to do 3 things. 1. Hit subscribe, because I'm not done telling the stories they tried to bury. History isn't just battles and kings, it's the people who were used and discarded, and they deserve to be heard. 2. Share this video. Not because I want views, though that helps, but because 800 women spent 544 years being forgotten. Let's make sure that ends today. And 3, leave a comment. Tell me, did you learn this in school? Did you know this happened? Because if you didn't, ask yourself why. Ask yourself who decided this story wasn't worth teaching. And then ask yourself what other stories we're still not being told. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And I'm choosing to remember the women of Otranto. Not as victims, not as footnotes, not as ghosts, but as human beings who deserved better, from the Ottomans, from the church, and from history itself. Let's give them what they deserved. Let's remember.